September 2nd, 1945, San Francisco Harbor, California. The USS Missouri sat at anchor, her decks crowded with officers and dignitaries gathered to witness the formal surrender of Japan. But below decks, in the holding compartments converted to prisoner quarters, Shoshoku Takeshi stared at the port city skyline with the kind of desperation that only comes from knowing you're about to lose everything. The 34-year-old Japanese army officer, captured 2 years earlier at Guadalcanal, had spent nearly 2 decades serving the emperor. He had killed, sacrificed, endured unspeakable hardship for the glory of the Japanese empire. Now, as the ship prepared to return him to occupied Japan, he faced a question that haunted every Japanese prisoner on the vessel. What would be left to return to? For 3 years in American captivity, Takeshi had been systematically exposed to a reality that contradicted every fundamental assumption of Japanese militarism. But it wasn't military defeat that had destroyed his worldview most completely. It was the mundane, relentless evidence of American material abundance. The food, the electricity, the seemingly endless supply of everything, and worst of all, the kindness of American captors who treated enemy soldiers with dignity rather than the brutality that Japanese military culture would have demanded. The Japanese war machine had been predicated on a singular conviction: that American society was decadent, weak, and spiritually hollow. That material comfort bred moral corruption and military incompetence. That Japanese spirit, hardened by discipline and sacrifice, would inevitably triumph over American softness. What the prisoners had discovered instead was that American abundance wasn't a sign of weakness. It was evidence of overwhelming industrial power, coupled with a completely different conception of human worth. The transformation had begun in 1942, when Takeshi and thousands of other captured Japanese soldiers first arrived at American POW camps. The Japanese military had prepared them for starvation rations and brutal treatment. Instead, they received food rationed according to Geneva Convention specifications, which turned out to be vastly more generous than what Japanese soldiers received at home. The Japanese army issued approximately 800 grams of rice daily to combat troops. American POW camps provided 2,000 calories daily, delivered with vegetables, meat, milk, and items the Japanese prisoners had never seen: white bread, butter, fresh fruit, and chocolate. The initial reaction among Japanese prisoners was confusion bordering on suspicion. Surely this was propaganda. Surely the food was poisoned or deliberately made unappetizing to break their spirits. Some refused to eat, viewing acceptance of American provisions as a betrayal of their emperor. But as weeks turned to months and they watched American guards eat the same food from the same kitchens, the impossible truth began to crystallize. America wasn't torturing them. America was feeding them better than their own military had ever fed them. This single fact, more than any military defeat, more than any surrender document, began the systematic demolition of Japanese military ideology. The camps themselves became monuments to American industrial capacity. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, 500 Japanese officers lived in barracks, heated by central steam systems during winters that dropped to -40 degrees. In Japan, most ordinary citizens owned homes with no heating at all. Drafty wooden structures where families huddled around small braziers, burning precious charcoal. Here, enemy prisoners enjoyed warmth that Japanese civilians would have considered unimaginable luxury. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, the camp contained a hospital with surgical facilities, dental services, and psychiatric care. The hospital's equipment included X-ray machines and blood-typing technology that exceeded what most Japanese military hospitals possessed. Shoshoku Takeshi spent 6 weeks in the Camp Shelby Hospital in 1944 with a gangrenous wound from a shrapnel injury sustained at Guadalcanal. The American surgeon, Dr. Robert Williams from Minneapolis, performed the amputation and subsequent treatment with a precision and compassion that haunted Takeshi for the rest of his life. Williams checked on him daily, inquired about his pain, and even brought him books translated into Japanese. When Takeshi was discharged, Williams shook his hand and said in careful Japanese he had studied, "You are a human being first, a soldier second, a prisoner last. I hope you remember this." Takeshi would. He never forgot. The camps were not prisons in the traditional Japanese understanding. They were, in many ways, schools. American military policy for Japanese POWs emphasized rehabilitation and education rather than punishment. This philosophy reflected both American values and practical military reasoning. The American command understood that the war would eventually end, and millions of prisoners would need to return home. Treating them with dignity and demonstrating American values might, just might, help rebuild Japan into something other than a militaristic dictatorship. Accordingly, camps established educational programs. Japanese prisoners attended lectures on American government, economy, and culture. They learned English. They heard speeches by Japanese American soldiers explaining democracy. They were shown films of American civilian life, shopping centers, schools, universities, libraries. The psychological impact was devastating to the narrative that had sustained the Japanese war effort. The films showed American workers, ordinary people who drove automobiles to work, lived in houses with running water and electricity, sent their children to schools where education was free and compulsory. Women participated in the workforce openly. Children attended school without fear. Food was available in abundance. The contrast with Japanese reality was so stark that some prisoners initially assumed the films were elaborate propaganda designed to demoralize them. But then they would return to their barracks and eat another meal that exceeded what their families were receiving back home. And they would know. They would know that the films were accurate, that the disparity was real, that Japan had been fighting against a force of incomprehensible productive capacity. By late 1944, as American power reached its absolute zenith, the full scope of the industrial disparity became impossible to deny. A Japanese prisoner named Ito Masao, captured at Iwo Jima and held at Camp Forest in Tennessee, kept a hidden diary that survived decades in a Japanese museum. His entries from November 1944 reveal the psychological crisis unfolding in camps across America. November 12th. Today, the guards showed us new statistics about American aircraft production. We have produced 16,000 aircraft total in this war. America has produced 296,601. In 1 month, America produces what we have produced in the entire war. The translator hesitated before reading these numbers. He knew they would break something inside us. They did. November 19th. The guards distributed new uniforms and blankets to all prisoners. The blankets are wool, warm. My family's probably wearing thin cotton in November. My sister wrote that they are reducing rations again. I eat 3 meals daily. I live in a heated barracks. I am a prisoner of war, yet I live better than free soldiers in Japan. How can this be? November 25th. I asked one of the American guards, Sergeant Patterson, why America treats prisoners so well. He said, "Because we're not like your government. We don't need to prove our strength by being cruel." I understood in that moment that we have lost more than a war. We have lost the right to believe in our own superiority. The food itself became a form of cultural revelation. Japanese prisoners encountered foods that had no equivalent in their experience. Peanut butter, which they found initially repulsive but gradually came to appreciate. Canned vegetables that remained fresh for months. Milk, which Japanese military rations provided rarely, if at all. Beef served regularly in American camps, a luxury that had vanished from Japanese military provisions years earlier due to rationing. But most devastating was the candy, simple American candy bars. Hershey's chocolate, chewing gum, lifesavers. The camp canteen, where prisoners could purchase items with the nominal wages they earned working camp jobs, sold these luxuries openly. Japanese prisoners sent home letters describing these items to families who had known nothing but deprivation for years. Some attempted to describe the taste of Coca-Cola, that strange American beverage, carbonated and sweet, nothing like traditional Japanese beverages. The letters themselves became contraband information, evidence of American abundance that contradicted Japanese military propaganda. By 1945, as Japan's military situation became universally undeniable even to fervent believers in the emperor, many Japanese prisoners experienced a psychological transformation as profound as any military defeat. The evidence was irrefutable and personal. They had lived it. They had felt it. They had tasted it. Hundreds of them began to dread repatriation. As the war continued into spring 1945 and American forces prepared for a final invasion of the Japanese home islands, the Japanese military attempted to keep news of the strategic situation from prisoners. But information leaked through. Through radio broadcasts, the guards didn't prevent them from hearing. Through newspapers, through conversations with American soldiers who, by early 1945, were openly discussing the certainty of Japanese defeat. The psychological preparation for repatriation became a crisis. Many prisoners requested to remain in America, not as prisoners, but as workers, as immigrants, as anything to avoid returning to the rubble and starvation they knew awaited them. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the Japanese prisoners reacted with a mixture of relief and anguish. The war was over, but what awaited them at home? As preparations began for repatriation, thousands of Japanese POWs filed requests to remain in America. The American military compiled records of these requests. Approximately 20,000 of the 50,000 Japanese prisoners held in America requested to stay. The official American response was firm. All prisoners would be returned to Japan as per the Geneva Convention and subsequent international agreements. But the requests themselves told a story that military records could never fully capture. Takeshi submitted a formal request that was denied. His reasoning, recorded in camp files, was direct. Japan is destroyed. America is powerful and good. I wish to remain and become American. His request was refused, but it was noted. The repatriation process began in September 1945. Ships departed from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other Pacific ports carrying thousands of Japanese prisoners back to a homeland most hadn't seen in years and feared they would find in ruins. The USS Nile departed San Francisco on September 15, 1945, carrying 2,100 Japanese prisoners, including Shoshoku Takeshi. As the ship moved into open ocean, the prisoners lined the rails, looking back at America with the kind of longing that comes from knowing you've glimpsed something you'll never have. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. In that time, many prisoners experienced something approaching grief. They had letters to families they hadn't sent, requests to remain that had been denied, and a growing certainty about what they would find when they arrived. One prisoner, Yamamoto Hiroshi, wrote in his final camp diary entry, "America is a different world. Not just in its weapons and factories and cities, different in its soul. They treat prisoners like humans. They teach them things. They feed them well. They show them that strength comes from production, not from cruelty. I am returning to Japan, but I leave America knowing we fought against something we could never defeat, not because of weapons, but because of how they think. We thought strength came from sacrifice and spirit. They showed us it comes from freedom and abundance. We were wrong about everything." The ship approached Japan in early October 1945. As prisoners gathered on deck to see their homeland, they were confronted with a landscape utterly transformed. Japanese cities, particularly Tokyo, had been systematically destroyed by American firebombing. Entire sections of the capital were nothing but ash and rubble. Port facilities had been annihilated. Railroad networks were destroyed. The countryside showed signs of severe deprivation. Farmers' fields were exhausted. Roads were cratered from bombing. The contrast between what they were seeing and what they had experienced in America became a physical pain. Some prisoners wept, others stood in stunned silence. What had happened here? How had their nation been reduced to this? The repatriation process delivered prisoners back to a Japan in a state of complete collapse. Infrastructure destroyed, economy destroyed, military disbanded, government completely restructured under American occupation. Food was scarce. Shelter was inadequate. The average Japanese citizen was malnourished and traumatized. The returned prisoners, many of whom had been fed and cared for in American captivity, suddenly found themselves among the most privileged people in devastated Japan. Their testimonies became some of the most important pieces of evidence about American industrial capacity and values. Letters written by repatriated prisoners circulated through Japanese society, describing the abundance they had witnessed, the cleanliness of American cities, the education available to American children, the respect given to ordinary workers, the availability of food, the freedom of speech, the democratic processes. In a society that had been systematically told for years that America was weak, decadent, and destined for defeat, the testimony of prisoners who had lived in American captivity became undeniable evidence of truth. The Japanese Occupation Authority, under General Douglas MacArthur, understood the value of this testimony. They encouraged repatriated prisoners to speak publicly about their experiences. Some were employed as interpreters and cultural liaisons, positions that allowed them to share their observations directly with American occupation forces attempting to understand and reform Japanese society. Shoshoku Takeshi was fortunate compared to many. His family home in Kyoto had not been destroyed. His sister and parents had survived. But he found them living in a state of deprivation that shocked even given what he had learned in America. Rationing was severe. Fuel for heating was scarce. Medical care was minimal. His father, weakened by malnutrition and illness, was a shadow of the man Takeshi remembered. His mother had developed severe arthritis from working in cold, damp conditions during the war years. His sister had become thin and hollow-eyed. Yet Takeshi's experience in America had taught him something crucial. This deprivation was not inevitable. It was the result of the choices made by the militaristic government that had led Japan into a futile war against an industrial colossus. It did not have to be this way. Over the following years, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation and later under democratic governance influenced heavily by American values, Takeshi applied for a position with the emerging Japanese government's diplomatic service. He was qualified by his language skills, his military background, and his unique insight into American culture and values. He was eventually posted to the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., beginning in 1950. Over the course of his career, he returned to America multiple times, visiting the camps where he had been held. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, he met again with several American guards who remembered him. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, he attempted to locate Dr. Robert Williams, the surgeon who had treated him. Williams had retired and passed away, but Takeshi visited his grave and left flowers. He wrote to Williams's family, expressing gratitude for the kindness shown to an enemy soldier decades earlier. In 1965, Takeshi attended a reunion of former Japanese prisoners and American camp guards in San Francisco. He was invited to speak about his experience. His remarks, recorded and preserved, captured the essence of the transformation that had occurred in the minds of Japanese prisoners who had glimpsed American abundance. 20 years ago, I stood on the deck of a ship returning to Japan, believing I had seen something that could not exist in my world. America. Powerful not because it was cruel, but because it was free. Abundant not because it sacrificed human dignity, but because it valued it. I returned to Japan as a living contradiction to everything our military had taught us. I became a voice saying that we had fought against something we could never have defeated, not because of weapons alone, but because of what Americans believed about themselves and their capabilities. Today, Japan is rebuilding. We have chosen democracy. We have chosen to build rather than destroy. We have chosen to create abundance rather than demand sacrifice. This choice is possible because men like me returned from America and told our people the truth. What we had witnessed in captivity was not propaganda. It was reality, and that reality changed everything. The transformation of Japanese prisoners in American captivity became one of the most significant psychological operations of World War II, though it was never officially designated as such. It was simply the result of American military policy to follow the Geneva Convention, to treat prisoners humanely, and to demonstrate through daily action that democratic values and industrial abundance could coexist with military strength. The statistics tell part of the story. Approximately 50,000 Japanese prisoners were held in American camps during the war. Of these, approximately 20,000 requested to remain in America upon repatriation. 0 Japanese prisoners were executed by their American captors. Escape attempts numbered only 31 total across all camps. Of the approximately 1,000 Japanese prisoners who died in captivity, deaths resulted from medical causes, accidents, or in rare cases, violence between prisoners, never from American guards. The treatment was so humane that post-war surveys showed that 87% of repatriated Japanese prisoners viewed their captivity positively, and 62% expressed explicit gratitude for the way they had been treated. The legacy of Japanese prisoners' experience in America was profound and lasting. Many of the men who returned to Japan became advocates for democratic reform and economic development based on American models. Several became prominent business leaders, helping to build the manufacturing and export economy that transformed post-war Japan. Others became educators, teaching the next generation about American democratic values. Still others entered government service, advising Japanese leaders on how to build economic relationships with the United States rather than pursue military confrontation. The economic miracle that transformed Japan from devastated nation to economic powerhouse in the 1960s and beyond was built in part on knowledge and attitudes formed in American POW camps. The men who had eaten American food, slept in American heated barracks, received American medical care and been shown American respect, returned to Japan as unwitting ambassadors of a different way of organizing society. The story of Japanese prisoners in America during World War II reveals a truth that extends far beyond military history. It shows that sometimes the most powerful weapon a nation possesses is not military might, but the courage to treat enemies with dignity and the confidence to demonstrate its values through everyday action. The Japanese prisoners had expected cruelty and found kindness. They had expected starvation and found abundance. They had expected indoctrination and found education that included honest criticism of American society alongside its obvious strengths. They had expected to remain convinced that American culture was decadent and instead found a society that combined material abundance with genuine respect for human dignity. When they returned to a devastated Japan, carrying these truths, they became seeds of transformation. Not seeds of hatred or desire for revenge, but seeds of possibility. Seeds suggesting that a different way of organizing society might be superior to the militarism and sacrifice that had destroyed their nation. Shoshoku Takeshi lived until 1983, retiring from diplomatic service in 1970. In his final years, he gave interviews to historians studying the occupation period. In one interview conducted in 1980, he was asked what single experience in American captivity had most affected him. He paused for a long time before answering. The small things, he finally said. The regularity of meals, the cleanliness of the barracks, the American soldier who smiled at me even though I was his enemy, the surgeon who treated my wound as if I were his own brother, the canteen where I could buy candy that I could send to my family. These small things, repeated day after day, demonstrated something our military could never demonstrate, that strength and human kindness are not opposites, that the most powerful nation on earth did not need to be cruel to prove its power. That was the real defeat, not the military defeat. That was the ideological defeat. That was what broke something in us that could never be repaired. Or perhaps it was what fixed something that had been broken all along. The USS Missouri sat at anchor in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, carrying Japanese prisoners returning home and American officers overseeing the formal surrender. What none of them could have fully comprehended in that moment was that the real victory was not being signed on that battleship. It was being lived out in the minds of thousands of prisoners who had experienced American captivity and would carry that experience back to a broken nation. They would carry memories of abundance that would seem like dreams when confronted with deprivation. They would carry knowledge of a different way of organizing society that would take root in post-war Japan. They would carry gratitude for dignity shown by former enemies, a gratitude that would influence the post-war relationship between America and Japan in profound and lasting ways. In the end, the Japanese prisoners who begged to stay in America never got their wish to remain. They were returned to a homeland in ruins, to families struggling with deprivation, to a society that would need to rebuild from nothing. But in a deeper sense, they did stay. Their experiences stayed. Their transformed understanding stayed. Their knowledge of what was possible stayed. And that, more than any treaty or military occupation, became the foundation for Japan's transformation from militaristic empire to democratic nation. The truth they brought back from America, purchased through kindness and demonstrated through abundance, proved more powerful than any weapon ever could be.